Hello, my name's Gary Donnelly, and I've been asked to chair tonight's proceedings. Uh, Justice for the Craigavon 2 Committee is organising tonight's session, and it's one of a number which will be taking place throughout the country. I would like to welcome everyone here to Derry tonight, and thank you for showing your support for the Craigavon 2 campaign. I would like a special mention for the families of Brendan and John Paul who are with us here tonight. The case of the Craigavon 2 is another milestone of British injustice in Ireland. The British state is relentlessly pursuing Republicans because of their political beliefs. There is a growing list of cases in which manipulation of evidence and distortion of reality are cornerstones. Time and time again, the British establishment has shown itself to be rotten, manipulative and slippery with the truth. For example, the Bloody Sunday families have been told there is no money to investigate mass murder on the streets of Derry by the same people who decided to allocate millions fighting legal actions in Boston. And in the case of Ivor Bell, is another example of unfolding British injustice, an attempt to scapegoat a pensioner for the actions of others who seem to be untouchable. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of the late Tony Catney and Jerry Conlon for their tireless efforts to highlight the case of the Craigavon 2. Thank you. Just before we continue, if anyone who hasn't already switched off their mobile phones or put them in silent, could they please do so now? Unfortunately, due to a technical difficulty, we're unable to bring you a short video outlining the case of the Craigavon 2. So I'll go first, the first of tonight's speakers, who is Sarah Wilson, a daughter of the late Jerry Conlon and a representative of KRW legal firm, Belfast.
As you're aware, my dad was the previous chairman of this campaign, so thank you for inviting me to carry on his torch and campaign for this miscarriage of justice. This case meant a lot to him, and I'm sure he's watching over us all tonight. I did have a PowerPoint prepared, but it isn't working, so I'm just going to have to take you through it. The issues to be explored are going to be, firstly, a brief summary of events. Secondly, the role of the prosecution. Then moving on to the reasoning used by the judge to convict at the Crown Court. The sentences, the Court of Appeal decision, the certified question, which was the point of law raised with the Supreme Court, adverse inferences, and then moving on to the future. The Craigavon 2 were arrested on the 9th of March 2009. They were at the Crown Court on the 30th of March 2012 and found guilty of murder. At the Court of Appeal on the 29th of May 2014, the appeal against their conviction was dismissed. And on the 24th of October this year, the certified question to the Supreme Court was granted, and then the date to the Supreme Court is to be confirmed. The role of the prosecution then. One golden thread is always to be seen, that it is the duty of the prosecution to prove the prisoner's guilt. If, at the end of and on the whole of the case, there is a reasonable doubt created by the evidence given, either by the prosecution or the prisoner, the prosecution has not made out the case, the prisoner is entitled to an acquittal, no matter what the charge. So, what the judge used to convict at the Crown Court. Lord Justice Garvin said the combination of circumstances presented to the court produces compelling evidence of the guilt of Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton. The presence of Brendan McConville at the firing point, his association with Wootton on the night in question, the presence of Wootton and his car in Drumbeg at all material times, the presence of McConville's jacket in the back of the boot, the gunshot residue in the car, the documents from the computer. The culmination of all these circumstances leads the court to draw the appropriate inferences. There is no account from the defendants. They have chosen to say nothing in relation to the case, which is one which cries out for an explanation from each of them. In the circumstances, the court must draw the inference proper in the circumstances. If there were an innocent explanation, they would have been easily capable of providing it to the court, but chose not to do so. Brendan McConville was given a minimum term of 25 years. John Paul Wootton, a minimum term of 14 years and increased 18 this year. At the Court of Appeal, the judge confirmed the convictions. Moving on then to the certified question for the Supreme Court. It's noteworthy that there were a number of questions actually submitted to the Court of Appeal for approval, which are available to be viewed. However, this is the one the Court of Appeal accepted. Whether in a case in which the prosecution is insufficient to establish any specified role in a crime by that appellant, and there is no direct evidence of any agreement with those involved in the murder, it is proper to permit the drawing of adverse inferences against the appellant by reason of his failure to give evidence. Such an inference contributing to the conclusion on the totality of the evidence that the appellant was beyond reasonable doubt involved in the crime in some undefined way. So I've summarised that up. Can an adverse inference be drawn in a case in which a man's role in a murder cannot be identified, and in relying on this, is it sufficient to convict? So adverse inferences, what actually are they? When a judge can penalise a defendant at trial for, firstly, if they do not mention when questioned something which they later rely on in court. Secondly, failure to account for their presence in a particular place or possession of a particular object or mark found on clothing in any place at the time of his arrest. And finally, silence at trial. So the adverse inferences the judge relies upon in this case are: there's no account given for DNA, no evidence at trial, and no account given at the police station. Despite Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton's broadcasted innocence, the only question the Court of Appeal is prepared to entertain is: if someone's role within a criminal act is unclear, how can you draw the conclusion that they actually carried out the act? How can the court draw an adverse inference in this instance? If you can't define a role, how can you define the intent? I'm now going to discuss some case law which draws a direct comparison how other judges came to a different conclusion on similar issues in relation to evidence, etc., raised in this case. So firstly, the right to silence. Can an adverse inference be drawn when a person exercises their right to silence when there is no evidence given? The right to silence is protected by the European Convention on Human Rights, but it is not an absolute right. Whether the drawing of an adverse inference from an accused's silence infringes Article 6 is a matter to be determined in light of all the circumstances of the case. Having particular regard to the situations where inferences may be drawn, the weight to be attached to them by national courts in their assessment of evidence, and the degree of compulsion inherent in the situation. The reality, however, is that there are an increasing number of cases in which the right to silence is being stripped away from individuals. DNA. An example of this is R.V. Shivers at the Crown Court. There could be no doubt that a person who set fire to the car played an essential role in the murderous attack, but by setting fire to the car, they were trying to destroy the evidence that might lead to the arrest of the others involved. The judge was satisfied that Brian Shiver's DNA was on the matchsticks in the back seat. Those matches were used to set fire to the car before all those present left the scene. There was an extremely strong inference from the fact that Brian Shiver's DNA got onto the two matches when he used them to start the fire. The judge said that the inference was strengthened by traces of Brian Shiver's DNA found in the mobile phone, something that he was wholly unable to account for. So the judge said then, taking all these matters together, he is satisfied that the prosecution has proved beyond reasonable doubt that Brian Shiver set fire to the Cavalier, and he found him guilty of murder. At the appeal, however, he was acquitted. The judge did not say that Brian Shivers was one of the gunmen, and Lord Justice Deeney at the Court of Appeal said that the DNA linking Brian Shivers to the car did not prove he had been involved on the night of the shooting. In relation to this same case, R.V. Duffy, his DNA was basically found on the car, but the judge rules suspicion, no matter how strong, is not sufficient by itself to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and is not an acceptable substitute for facts which guilt can be properly proved. I consider that there is insufficient evidence to satisfy me beyond reasonable doubt that whatever Duffy may have done when he wore the latex glove and handled or touched the seatbelt buckle meant that he was preparing the car in some way for a murderous attack, and I therefore find him not guilty on each count. In relation to Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton, the cartridge discharge residue the prosecution accepted cannot account for the amount of cartridge discharge residue on the jacket and confirm it did not come from that firing event. So essentially it was meaningless. They were just trying to introduce bad character. Witness M. Witness M was described by his father as a Walter Mitty type character. He was unreliable, unbelievable. His account was given 11 months after the initial arrests. He lied about his eyesight. There was no transparency. The case was heard in a diplock court with only a single judge. A jury wouldn't have believed him. His eyesight was poor. He called the police up drunk. He may have had ulterior motives, benefited from the witness protection scheme. His testimony was filled with inconsistencies, yet the judge still permitted his evidence. Moving on then to the reliability of witness M, his eyesight. He first denied he wore glasses. Then, when faced with the truth, he accepted he did, but for fashion purposes. A bit like me. The judge, however, asked the question, over what distance would his eyesight actually be reliable? Dr. Page, a consultant at the Royal Victoria Hospital, a prosecution witness, said that witness M should not be able to identify facial features beyond a distance of 8 yards. The shortest distance between the path along which witness M claimed to have walked and the electricity box where he claimed to have seen the appellant is just over 16 yards. Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton were already in custody when witness M phoned the police and he said he could help. He said he passed Brendan McConville standing under a streetlight where 5 different paths meet. In the pouring rain, saying hello to someone he had never met before. Does that sound like someone to you who would take part in a murder? No. He was not there for the actual purpose of committing a murder. John Paul Wootton. There is no suggestion that he fired the shot which killed the officer. There is no evidence to show that he was involved in the planning or preparation. No evidence to suggest he was nearby the firing point. One of the reasons he actually couldn't give evidence was that there were forensics in the car which suggested there had been many firearms in the vehicle, and therefore anything he would say would potentially link him to other fabricated charges. Brendan McConville, it is accepted that he did not fire the shot which killed the deceased, and it is accepted he was not involved in the planning or preparation of the murder. Looking to the future then, this is a case in which all of the legal representatives involved are very alarmed. We are determined to keep going with this until the miscarriage of justice is rectified. In the meantime, the families, the friends, the human rights groups involved should continue to keep up their great work and, more importantly, provide support for one another, Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Tonight's next speaker is Angela Nelson. Angela is a former POW, internee, and currently an independent councillor for Lisburn. She is the current chairperson of the Justice for the Craigavon 2 Committee.
Thanks, everybody, for coming here tonight. It really pleases me when I see that there are people interested in this case, because it's the biggest miscarriage of justice in our time, in modern times. This is to be equated with the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6 and the Maguire 7. But it's 2014, and with all of the Good Friday Agreement and the new dispensation that we were promised, for this peace that we're living in my opinion, peace without justice is no peace at all. You heard from the solicitor there, and it's actually lovely for us to have the actual daughter of Jerry Conlon here with us tonight. Jerry was the chairperson before I took it on, and they're hard shoes to fill, let me tell you. Jerry, because of his own experience of being 14 years in prison for something he didn't do, and where his father died in prison for something he didn't do, opened many doors for us throughout the world. He travelled all over America, Canada, and other places to spread a word about this miscarriage of justice, and he is badly missed, let me tell you. The thing about this case is, you know, from start to finish, it was a setup. From the get-go, you know, what happened was there was two soldiers shot dead in Masserine Barracks, and within 48 hours, Stephen Carroll was shot dead also. He was the first policeman to be shot since the Good Friday Agreement, and he was a Catholic, not that it matters, but they were playing up that there, that he was a 48-year-old Catholic and the first policeman shot now. From that, they closed down Lurgan, Craigavon, and all surrounding villages around there, and they arrested everybody in sight. Now, with John Paul Wootton, they, oddly enough, had television cameras in the sky to witness his arrest, where they took him out quite dramatically in handcuffs in a white forensic suit, and this was all televised and put over. Brendan McConville, they used the picture of Brendan. There's one out in the foyer there. That is Brent McConville. That is out in the foyer. The one that they show all of the time was after 13 days of interrogation, when he was unshaven, unshowered, and had gone through intense questioning. But it makes it look good to the public eyes and to those who blindly accept that these two people are responsible for the murder. Now, they were in custody for 11 months before witness M phoned at 3 o'clock in the morning, drunk. He was that drunk that the policeman who took the call, who recorded the call, could hardly make him out. And his words in that respect were, "If I told you I seen something about the shooting of that policeman, would I get paid? Would I get money for it?" And of course, they had been in custody for 11 months. There was no evidence, and there isn't any evidence to link any of these two men to this case. There is nothing tangible. There is no forensic that would link these two men to this case. It's diabolical that they have spent 5 years in prison when they're totally innocent of anything to do with this case. But he was taken, he was brought into the barracks, he was told he would be rehoused. All of his debts, which were into thousands and thousands of pounds, would be cleared. Debit cards, credit cards, and all of the rest of it. He would be set up in a new home as long as he would be given evidence. Now, we are not allowed to name him, but everybody knows his name. He has to be referred to as Witness M. That's how he's referred to. He said him and his partner were walking in this late night when this shooting happened, in the bucket and rain, in bad lighting, through a path. He was with his girlfriend and they were walking their dog on their way to his father's house. His father could not believe that anybody would believe his son, and he was the one that called him Walter Mitty. He called him Walter Mitty. He says nobody in the family took anything he said without a bucket of salt beside them. That's how much of a liar he was. He always wanted to make himself look important, and he told stories, and that's what he was known within the family. When the two boys were found guilty at the first trial, the father, in his conscience, in fairness, he could have walked away, but in his conscience couldn't believe that somebody was sentenced to 25 years based on his son's evidence, and another boy, who was 17 at the time of his arrest, was sentenced to 14 years. He was not coerced or threatened or approached. He contacted the legals representing the lads and said that he wanted to have an affidavit stating the case about his son, and that his son was a Walter Mitty, and that he couldn't have seen it. And his way of explaining it was that his son was living with a violent partner, and that his son was a victim of domestic violence, and that he told his son that while he remained in this relationship with this woman, he was no longer welcome in his home. He says many's a night he knocked his door and the blood was pouring out of him, and he was in a terrible state because this woman, who we're led to believe is a foreign lady, beat him up. So he was not going to see him because he was not welcome in his home. He didn't have a dog to walk, and also at no time was the female companion that he alleged he was with was taken into questioning to corroborate his story. Now, right there, it tells you that the whole thing is a setup, and that they have two scapegoats, Brett McConville and John Paul Wootton, to take the hit. They thought nobody would bat an eyelid out. When I watched it on the TV myself, and I have been a long time around and know the way that these MI5 agents work and the way the things can be made to look, I thought the two lads had done it and they were caught and tough. It's only when I started to look into the case, as did Jerry Conlon, and you meet the families and you talk to them, and you meet the men and you talk to them, and you realise that from the get-go it was two scapegoats, Brent McConville and John Paul Wootton. But this is 5 years now. We've had a trial, we've had an appeal. When the wee man went forward and gave his evidence to the legals, and the police heard about it, they then tried to sabotage the appeal. They arrested that wee man, who's in his 70s, and held him for over 48 hours in the serious crime unit in Antrim. They bugged his phone, his car, his home. They followed him. They threatened him. They said that the IRA had held a gun to his head and told him to make the statement. I witnessed that wee man standing in the dock day after day, with going through terrible questioning from the prosecution of the QC, Kieran Murphy. And he steadfastly stood his ground, and he said that it had caused rows in his family, it had caused breakups, and he says, how do you think I feel standing here giving evidence against my son? I did not choose to do it, but I could not believe that you took the word of my son, who is a Walter Mitty, and put two men in prison for it. And in his conscience, he could not and would not stand idly by. We who witnessed the appeal heard Declan Morgan, the Lord Chief Justice, may God protect us from him. He turned around and asked the prosecution counsel at the time 3 questions and said to him, Have you proved beyond reasonable doubt that the gun residue found on the coat was the residue from this gun that was used in the shooting of Constable Carroll? No, Your Honour. Have you two more questions he put to him. Have you proved this beyond reasonable doubt? No, Your Honour. So we're sitting thinking, the boys are coming home with us today. Brilliant. They're getting out because he's just said that he didn't at any time prove beyond reasonable doubt that the boys were guilty. It was never raised that the previous owner of John Paul Wootton's car belonged to a gun club. So the gun residue found in the boot of his car that wasn't associated with the AK-47 used in the shooting could have been belonging to those two people who were in a gun club. So none of this here was taken on board. That man's statement, and he was days in there getting through all of this here, and he was badgered by the prosecution. And when it was all over, we definitely came out feeling elated. We and the families thought, you know, that was good. Our barristers done good. The prosecution admitted they hadn't proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. So it would be, the next step is, we wait on the decision, but it'll be, the boys will get released. When that decision did come and we went down, we were no sooner in through the revolving doors till we were out again, when Declan Morgan once more got up and he says, appeal dismissed, gone. We came out, we were shell-shocked, we were in tears, we were hugging each other. The legal representatives were standing there shocked, speechless, and you know most solicitors, not you, darling, could talk the leg of a donkey, you know. They were all speechless. They couldn't believe it. We couldn't even speak to the press when we came out because we thought that this case was going to be squashed that day because everything proved beyond a reasonable doubt that they were innocent. Everything did. But they were sentenced again. And then Barra McCrory, in his wisdom, wasn't happy that a 17-year-old boy at the time of his arrest had got 14 years. He wanted to increase it to 20 years. So it was increased to 18 years. So now we have two innocent men lying in prison for 5 years for something they didn't do, and everybody, the dogs in the street, knows it. The cops know it, and I'll tell you, I'll go as far as saying Stephen Carroll's wife knows it. She knows that she didn't get the justice that day that she thought she was getting. These two men are the biggest miscarriage of justice in our time, and unless we all, people who believe in the justice of it and the injustice that we're witnessing, get up and do something about it, this is going to happen time after time after time. So I'm not going to take up all of your time. I could talk about this all night because I'm passionate about it. I am passionate about it, but I want every single person in this room to leave here passionate about it as well. I want you to say, we're joining your campaign. We'll go to your protests. We'll attend the discussions. We'll write to our MPs. We'll write to our MEPs. We'll write to our local councillors in jail or out of jail. And we will carry this campaign until the two men are released. That's what every single person in this room has to leave with, that feeling. I don't want just getting out of here and saying, I enjoyed that. That wasn't bad. He spoke well. She spoke well. I didn't know that. I want you to go out and say, this is absolutely disgusting. Not in my name. No, they're not your sons. But what if they were? What if they were?
Thank you, Angela. The next speaker is Father Raymond Murray. Father Murray has been a human rights activist for over 40 years and has worked on numerous high-profile campaigns.
I am going to take a look back into the past and also look at a wider context. In October 1978, I delivered speeches to 100 congressmen in Washington, D.C., and to that ad hoc Committee for Human Rights in Northern Ireland, Philadelphia. Among the demands I listed were an end to 7-day detention, an end to torture and ill treatment of arrested persons, an end to imprisonment without trial, an end to long remands without trial, an end to special diplomatic courts, the release of 18 Irish prisoners in Britain who were innocent. We are still campaigning some 40 years later against legal injustice. There is no adequate procedure for undoing miscarriages of justice. Our sympathy, of course, is with the family of Constable Stephen Carroll. We feel for his wife, Kate, his son, Shane, and all members of the family who have suffered grievously. The campaign for the Craigavon 2, Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton, sentenced for the murder, views their conviction as a miscarriage of justice. We feel for them also and for their families. The campaign points out the flaws in witness and forensic evidence, and we have, I'm going to say, 2 legal experts this evening, Sarah Wilson and my former student, I'd call her that, Angela Nelson. They have outlined the case of their innocence. And leaflets are also available to use summarising the flaws. The campaign for the Craigavon 2 is mounting at home and abroad, and in particular in the USA. In the last month or so, it's just spreading all over the USA due to a great friend, Helen McLafferty. And there's a gentleman here this evening, Julian Acom, who will be spreading the word in Canada, Cuba, and Venezuela. So this campaign follows fast on recent campaigns for the release of Marion Price, Martin Corey, and Jeremy Goh. John Finucane, solicitor for John Paul Wootton, at a campaign meeting in Belfast in August this year said, "A campaign will strengthen any legal avenue, and I have seen that personally in my father's case." Pat Finucane, of course. We are now seeing also an extraordinary development of international concern in the case of the Craigavon 2. After attending the appeal in their case, we were surprised by the long delay in the verdict and shocked at the judgment. We were so confident that they would be released. Now the case goes to the Supreme Court. Your support is urgently needed. Write, please, to the Secretary of State, Theresa Villiers, to the Minister for Justice, David Ford, and to the Taoiseach, Enda Kenny. There has been little interest in trials in the North by the Irish government when doubt is cast on a conviction in a special diplomatic court. Yes, some TDs in recent years have entered campaigns for justice and are at present involved in the Craigavon 2 campaign, and we are grateful to them. Bring your views also before local politicians, North and South, and to human rights organisations. A year ago, I spoke at a conference in London organised by personnel from Wiltshire University. After my speech, a man approached me flanked by 2 women. It was Billy Parr and his 2 daughters coming to greet me. The last time I saw him was in Brixton Prison. Billy, as you know, innocent man, one of the Birmingham 6, spent 16 years in prison. Father Dennis Fall and I wrote a pamphlet, The Birmingham Framework, within a year after the conviction of the Birmingham 6, and also a broadsheet on the forensic aspects of the case. There was ample evidence in those 2 publications to prove that they were innocent. Corruption of law meant that they and other innocents at that time were condemned to suffer in jail. Why do we still have to fight cases of legal injustice? I recall after giving a copy of our pamphlet, The Birmingham Framework, to a journalist, asking him some weeks later what he thought. Guilty as hell, he said. That's what you were up against. Yes, it took 16 years to build up the truth against hostile government and weak media, to establish counteraction to sentences which found the men guilty. We don't want such a delay in this case. Jerry Conlon, lately deceased, rest in peace, one of the Guildford Four, joined in this campaign for the release of Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton and called loudly for their release. He poured scorn on the evidence against them. He knew what it was like to suffer as an innocent in prison. He did not want them to suffer a similar fate as himself. Corruption of law. We had internment in the north in every decade of the Stormont monolithic unionist government. In the 1970s, it was introduced with ill treatment and torture. Besides the hooded men in Ballykelly, some 400 men within a few months were severely tortured and ill-treated in the Palace Barracks Hollywood and Girdwood Park Barracks Belfast. 130 of them came up to Armagh prison where I was chaplain. I went in for a week from morning to night, taking statements. They didn't know what it was at, of course. I made a lot of them strip. I got in an independent doctor. Authorities didn't know what it was at. I had medical evidence, and I never saw such ill treatment. Even after internment was formally ended in 1975, a substitute was found, doubling sentences and imposing charges so that innocent people were in jail for a year and a half before they were found innocent at their trial. The English government was found guilty of torture by the European Commission on Human Rights and guilty of inhuman and degrading treatment by the European Court of Human Rights. I went to Strasbourg myself as a witness. Their injustice is recorded in legal textbooks, and the hooded men are now bringing their case back to the European Court of Human Rights to have it declared that they had been tortured. Ian Cobin's book, Cruel Britannia, A Secret History of Torture, 2012, showed how the case of torture had long been a tradition and a policy of the British government. There is still no sense of guilt and reform in British governments regarding the tragedies of the conflict here. Are the Ombudsman and the Historic Inquiry team's work now to be wiped out with a denial of funding and a firm attitude threatening the closure of documentation regarding state violence and crime? Speaking at the University of Ulster in early November this year, European Human Rights Commissioner Niels Wijnieks insisted that the British government must uphold the rule of law and claimed that it had breached the European Convention of Human Rights by not conducting independent and prompt investigations into conflict killings. The British government for 40 years has avoided its responsibilities in relation to killings carried out by the security forces. Mr. Wijnieks said that budget cuts should not be used as an excuse to hamper the work of those working for justice. The British government in these cases and in the cases of convicted innocent people continues to fail victims. We never have had adequate procedure for undoing miscarriages of justice. We still have special courts. Why isn't everybody shouting about it? Why should we have special courts? During the 30 years conflict, diplomatic courts were not acceptable by people seeking truth and justice. And present traces of its workings in the Justice and Security Act, Northern Ireland Act 2007, in non-jury courts with their aura of injustice are not acceptable. The rule of law in Northern Ireland was corrupted by the use of illegal methods of interrogation and by the official efforts to cover up the use of these methods. The end can never justify the means. Justice, not expediency, is always the principle. Justice, freedom, and truth are helped by jury courts. Confidence in the protection of the law is vital to a free society. To retain non-jury courts for certain individuals leads to selectivity and the danger of prejudice. So clear, as has been pointed out. If this is seen in prosecution and preferring of charges, then confidence in the courts is undermined. It casts doubts on the objectivity of law officers of the Crown and the police. Law officers depend on security forces, intelligence, for information about crimes committed by private individuals thought to be members of or former members of prescribed organizations, and are therefore limited by the quality of their sources of information. Selectivity at stages of the application of the law disturbs peace and justice. During the conflict, Catholics, nationalists, felt they were denied civil rights and legal justice. This led to alienation. Any measure that indicates retention of selectivity casts doubts on the practice of justice. Little question. Will the Stormont government face the problem? Has it an interest in it at all? And what of ourselves? How can we fail to be anxious and concerned when we hear of injustice inflicted on individuals? The state is supposed to be the servant of its citizens, not the master. It always comes down to the individual with a name, a human being. Names, yes, Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton and their tormented families. They deserve our special attention. And we must not seek excuses for ourselves in the matter of injustice by just proclaiming the abstract. We thank you for attending this meeting. It is an indication that you want to be guided by justice, and as you have heard this evening, where there is injustice, there is suffering. I finish with words of Brendan McConville and John Paul Wootton themselves. Quoting, "While we must acknowledge that this partial court system is the only mechanism available to us to obtain our eventual release, we also acknowledge that the only real momentum for the realization of that eventuality will come from you, the public, and not from a system where the presumption of innocence has been replaced by a single judge who, along with his traditional role, also fulfills the role of the entire jury single-handedly. We place our faith in the jury that really matters, and that is the jury of public opinion. We ask that you demand justice for the Craigavon 2 and justice for all."
Tonight's final speaker is Peggy Carey. Peggy is an ex-POW and justice campaigner.
Accordia. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the campaign and how it started and how we got to where we are today. In 2012, I found myself in McGabry, sandwiched between two cells. On one side was Brendan McConville, on the other side was John Paul Wootton. Now, at that time, we were in protest, and we were in 23-hour lockup. So most of the time, if you weren't reading or trying to preoccupy yourself, you were down at the pipe talking. And we managed to pass paper between cells. We worked ways of passing small items. And over time, and through boredom, we passed each other's depositions, and you began to read each other's casework and become intricately aware of the case. Going into McGabry, I thought that Brenton McConville and John Paul Wootton had been captured, as it is, red-handedly in the aftermath of the shooting of Stephen Carroll. I followed it initially in the news and heard talk of the recovery of an AK-47 with a fingerprint on it. What the media failed to tell you was the fingerprint didn't belong to John Paul Wootton or Brenton McConville. A coat found in a car that was allegedly belonging to Brenton McConville that was covered in firearms residue. Again, the coat can't be proven to be Brenton McConville's. There's a slight trace of DNA on it that may or may not have came from a sneeze. There was also 6 other people's DNA on the coat. So how can you categorically say that that coat belonged to Brenton McConville? The residue, most definitely not coming from an AK-47 type firearm, as it lacked mercury fulminate in its makeup. In fact, it couldn't even be proven that it came from a fired weapon. There's speculation about where this residue may have come from, and the prosecution would lean to say that this residue somehow proved that John Paul Wootton was involved in some type of activity. Again, nothing definite, nothing proven. Certainly not proven beyond reasonable doubt that there was any involvement in the killing of Stephen Carroll. Then you have innuendo regarding a tracking device that was allegedly placed on John Paul Wootton's car on the night by the Secret Service and the SAS. And what you find out from that is that this tracking device places John Paul Wootton's car approximately 350 metres away from the alleged firing point. Now, 350 metres within a housing estate, within a built-up urban area, is a long distance, and certainly not somewhere you would expect someone to be sitting waiting for gunmen after they had fired on the PSNI or any other armed force. Probably most telling is 15 minutes after the shots that killed Stephen Carroll were fired, John Paul Wootton is still sitting in his car, still sitting 350 metres away, which, if it had been looked into properly, would have seen was outside his friend's house. And at 17 years of age, as a young lad with a car, a small sit-down Saxo, I believe it was, hardly your getaway material. How many 17-year-olds sit around the town, sit around the housing estate, rather than sit in the house and look at their mum and dad? You know, to try and insinuate that there was something untoward about him being in the area where he lives, being in the area where all his friends live, where all his family's from. You know, oh, he was in the area. What does that mean? He certainly wasn't at the firing point. It can't be proved that either man had a role, and this is basically where it comes down to with the Supreme Court. There's no role for either man. So if you can't say they had a role, they can tell you what they didn't do. They didn't fire the gun. They didn't plan it. How they knew that, I don't know. Because if you're assuming that they were part of it, then, oh, you're definitely part of it, but you didn't plan it. How did they know? And then they say, well, we draw inference. And it all comes down to, well, we think you done it. We think you done it because you won't get in the stand on account for why you did it. If that isn't ridiculous enough. And you don't take the stand because you have the right not to take the stand. So there must be safeguards for why you have the right not to take the stand. And it's something you've absolutely no idea of because you didn't have a part of it. Why should you get up and have to account for it? It's like going home this evening and watching TV and being asked to account for something that happened on the other side of the town on the same night. How can you account for it if you knew nothing about it, if you weren't there, if you weren't part of it? Yet that inference was due, and both men find themselves subject to life sentences 5 years into those life sentences. The campaign started once there was the realisation. I was there the day that the verdict came in. When I first went into McGabry and got out for the daily exercise in the yard, Brenton and John Paul weren't there. It wasn't until the weekend that I first met them. And the reason being that they were during the middle of their trial. And of course I went in with this presumption that both of them had been caught red-handed, and then you started to hear from the other prisoners, no, it isn't as clear-cut as that. Halfway through the trial, the defence teams actually put forward a no bill. They wanted the trial cancelled because they were saying there's no evidence here. why are we going through this whole charade when there's no evidence? We put forward a no bill. The no bill was knocked back. And there was a waiting period of months afterwards for the verdict to finally come in. And when the verdict came in, it was shocked. We were in the yard at the time, and the row 3 prisoners shouted out through the window at us. They said that the lads have been found guilty. And there was complete shock. It was, how low has the threshold for conviction become? Where innuendo and drawing conclusions based on evidence and ideas rather than finding facts, following those facts to finality that prove a point. So in the aftermath of that, I'm assuming on the outside, because I was on the inside, that the families were absolutely devastated. And Willie McConville, Brenton's father, done the only thing he thought he could do to busy himself, and he put together a small information pack, and it was largely to do with files that he obtained from the defence team, from the legal teams. And he wrote a short letter begging people for help, and he started posting these to people. He posted it to, I'm not sure exactly who all he posted, but I know it went to the likes of Amnesty International, it went out to the Archbishop, it went out to senior politicians. Very few replied. Amnesty International, to their internal shame, sent back a letter saying that they hadn't enough staff to even meet with Willie McConville, an international organisation with branches throughout the world. You'll find the southern branch all day on Twitter and Facebook talking about mental health issues. And while that is an issue that needs looked at in its own regard, it certainly isn't what Amnesty was founded to look at. And they're more than happy to bury their head in the sand regarding anything that happens within the UK or within Ireland, as long as it's not on their doorstep. If it's on their doorstep, they don't want to know. But if it's in Burma or somewhere else, they'll shout from the rooftops. If it's somewhere else, they'll get dressed up in orange boiler suits and march around the street. But ask them to even meet with you to discuss an injustice. And no, we'll not open the door to you. We'll not talk to you. And that's coming from Patrick Corrigan directly in Belfast. It's a shame on Patrick Corrigan. It's a shame on Amnesty International. But very quickly, what did happen was that at that time, Sarah was working with KRW. KRW had the case, and one of the leading solicitors met with Jerry Conlon and says, look, please take a look at this and give him the case files. And Jerry says, I've sort of been seeing a bit of that in the news, and I think them boys are banged their rights, But because of the background I come from, because I seen what happened with me, with the media, I'll take a look at the case. And Jerry went away and took a look at the case and become very, very concerned about what he read. Then he went to, the meetings were very, very early. The Craigavon 2 group had been pulled together. People like Tony Ketney, family members and other activists had pulled together to see was there anything at all that could be done. And one of the first things that the Craigavon 2 group seen was there was an urgent need to change the public perception of the case. If you went on Google and Googled Brent McConville or John Paul Wootton, killers, murderers, 2 red-haired bin Ladens basically, came up on Google. Every search, pictures, newspaper clippings from all over the world, all harping the exact same story, the same line, the same mantra that was fed down to the media from the prosecution. We get a bit of an insight into how the media works through this trial. A lot of cases, it comes down to finance and money, and the media won't send a reporter to sit all day at the courts to cover cases. Even in cases like Stephen Carroll's killing and cases like Mazarine, what they'll do is they'll rely on people who are called court reporters. And these are guys who sit in court all day, every day, 24/7. This is their job. And they'll write up summaries of what they hear in the courtroom. And what you'll find is, if you read the Belfast Telegraph, if you read the Irish News, and if you read the newsletter, you'll find that a lot of court cases, stories come across very, very similar. And that's because it's the same reporters wrote the story. It's this guy in the court, this boy who sits, and the court reporters were caught with their pants down in the case of Brian Shivers. Because they got fed up halfway through it and says, I'm going to go home at Brian Shivers' appeal. Nothing, it doesn't look like anything's going to happen. And they submitted the report, and the papers carried that report. But as the papers were going to print, Brian Shivers was walking out the front door of the court, and news media trumped print media. And these are the mechanisms that go on that you don't know nothing about. You lift the newspaper in the morning and you take it as gospel. This is gospel truth. This is the newspaper. These guys send reporters to these courts. But they rely on these same people who sit all day, every day, and who, through sitting through hours, because I've sat through some appeals and I've sat through some of the Craigavon 2 stuff, you do become numb to a lot of it. Sometimes you switch off because a lot of it becomes mundane and becomes mechanical. So this is how the media works, and this is how the media worked in this case. They all had the exact same line, and we set out from the beginning to change that line. And one of the greatest weapons we had for that was Jerry Conlon. Because Jerry's public figure, especially in the north, had been very low. He kept a low-key lifestyle. He'd lived his life. He'd done his activism. He'd been throughout the world. But he was below the surface in regards to what was happening in the media here in this country. And what happened very quickly was, once he read the material, once he seen what was happening in the case, once he met the families and made a decision, I'm going to join this group, I'm going to put my weight behind this, the first thing he done was contact the media. And he met with Connolly Young from the Irish News. I think Connolly's here tonight. Let's credit the Irish News, the people at Connolly. And some of the editors at the Irish News too give Connolly the scope to go, because what they done was they broke the mould. They didn't rely on the court reporter a lot during the Craigavon 2 appeal. They didn't rely on him when there was things coming up. People like Connolly not at times were allowed to go down to the court and see firsthand exactly what was going on and try and give a fair and accurate coverage of what's going on, because what you'll find is a lot of the sound bites that end up in the media come from the prosecution, and a lot of the prosecution's big, they'll hang on a big word like residue found in coat. Where did the residue come from? We found out the British Army had access to the vehicle. Did it come from a British Army source? Was the car they had control of the car, or was the car in a British Army camp? Half the tracking device was purposely wiped by the British Army and the Secret Service. Why did they wipe that? Did they wipe that to hide the fact that the car had been moved after the shooting into a British Army facility? Perhaps into an MI5 facility? What was the role of MI5 in this? This is all hidden. There's subterfuge, and everything's chopped and changed. The fact of the matter is, the tracking device should never have been allowed as feasible evidence, because the chain of custody had been broken. The military had it. Some unknown person had it, footed about with and deleted half of it. Then the PSNI had it. Then the court service had it. And now it's feasible evidence. What about this nameless person who accessed it via computer and interfered with the information that was on it? We're told it was wiped. Was there anything added to? What was wiped? Is it feasible that the piece that was wiped was the piece that would have exonerated John Paul Wootton? It was all theory that was given on the back of the tracking device, the whole case that was built around them. It was all theory, and we had to go out and try and counter that analogy that the media was carrying from the prosecution case. We done that successfully. Jerry Conlon's initial interview in the Irish News sent shockwaves through the system, and they didn't know how to tackle it, because Jerry Conlon was a victim himself. His father was a victim. His extended family and the Maguires were victims, all hung by the same system. And now he was tackling something. He was getting up and saying, what happened to me is happening here, is happening in the case of the Craigavon 2. And shortly after that, Paddy Joe Hill of the Birmingham 6 read the cases. He runs the Mojo Miscarriage of Justice organisation in Scotland, so he's no fool. The people at Mojo read the case. They stood up and they said the same thing. This is a miscarriage of justice. The media like to portray this group, the Justice for the Craigavon 2 group, as some sort of Republican support group. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, people like myself are Irish Republicans. Yes, Brenton McConville and John Paul Wootton are Irish Republicans. But the campaign for justice is non-political. And anyone who subscribes to the idea of a fair justice system can subscribe to this cause and to this campaign. We're not asking you, we're not playing by subterfuge. The facts are there in black and white on paper. We're saying, read those facts in black and white and then come to your own conclusions. We don't sit and bend your ear and say, it is or it isn't, or overlook this or overlook that. It's there in black and white. Read the facts. If you're on board, you're on board. If you're not, you have your own reasons for doing so. We lobby groups and political parties. We've met with Sinn Féin. We've met with the SDLP. We've met with People Before Profit. We've met with groups of TDs in the Dáil. Some have come on board. Some have been lukewarm, and some just plain haven't got back to us. But the established parties in the north fully support and back the justice system. And you hear stories about the dark side. Oh, there's a dark side to policing. There's a bright side and a dark side. What they don't tell you is 40% of the PSNI's budget goes into a dark side that's controlled by MI5. What they don't tell you is they signed up to this at the St Andrews Agreement, that in 2007, MI5 was given primacy, that the police ombudsman has no right to look into what MI5 does. But not only that, that prison officers and police officers working directly to MI5 then become agents of the Secretary of State and find themselves outside those accountability measures. This case feeds into a wider problem of the justice system here in the North. The fact of the matter is they tell us that everything's been reformed, that they reformed the PSNI, that the state's been reformed, that it's not what it was before 98. But in fact, if you look at the legislation used in this case, is more draconian than the legislation used in the 70s and the 80s. The legislation used in this case, the use of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, RIPA, which allows the agents of the state to go into anyone's home, bug anyone's phone, bug anyone's car. The state that you've seen it with Witness Z, Witness M's father, where they bugged everything. They bugged the pub where he drank. And against all this, when they started threatening him, and he dug his heels in and still gave his affidavit, they arrested him. They held him for 72 hours. But they didn't take him to the Serious Organised Crime Suite in Antrim, because that place is completely wired for sound. You can't talk in the toilet without being recorded. You can't go to the toilet without being video recorded. But they took him to Dungannon, where it's nice and safe, where you can go in and intimidate him in the cell where it won't be videoed, where you can have a wee chat in the corridor or a whisper in the ear and it'll not be overheard. And they put pressure on him for 72 hours. They took him in and said that he'd signed this affidavit with a gun to his head, that the IRA and the lawyers were in league with each other. A ridiculous statement. And they were trying to undermine the legal teams, to the point that afterwards, when the legal teams were exonerated, that numerous human rights organisations had to come in and lobby the United Nations to come in and protect the legal teams. Now, one of John Paul's brief is John Finucane. John Finucane's father was Pat Finucane. Pat Finucane was murdered for doing his job. And now we find that John Finucane has been under the same type of state surveillance that Pat Finucane was under. And that untoward and unseen hands, and the same hands who were moving through the murky world of collusion that led to Pat's death, the same hands are in play in how they're working with KRW law and with John Finucane, to the point that the UN has been lobbied to protect them. The Craigavon 2 group set out to interact with the media to highlight this and try and make sure that the horrors of the past don't revisit today's legal teams. We've lobbied many different groups. Many different justice groups have come on board and said that this is a miscarriage of justice, or that they would independently view the system and follow it. And many have since said they believe this to be a miscarriage of justice, that the system has acted wrongly. What you have from the start to the end is the malignant hand of the security service MI5. You have an unparalleled period of detention without charge. They were held for 13 days in Antrim. Then they're charged. What were they charged with? Because how could they, after 13 days, no witness M, who ended up being the key for the whole case. No witness M didn't come across for 11 months, but it was still enough. That was internment by remand. Another policy of the intelligence services and their new strategy for dealing with subversives and Irish Republicans. I myself fell victim to the same policy. All good. Once witness M came forward, now we can go to trial. They went to trial. On their way to trial, the prison service planted information in Brent McConville's cell. Explosives charges that were also brought at the same time between Brent McConville following his conviction disappear on the first day. It falls through. You have to ask yourself, was there ever a meaningful investigation into the death of Stephen Carroll? I don't believe so. The glaring fact at the appeal, when one of the judges says, have you got crime scene pictures of the brick that was thrown through the window that led to the police coming to the area? Panic. Can't find them. Don't know where they are. Was there any photos? Was there a crime scene? What exactly happened in the aftermath? They went straight out and they lifted Irish Republicans. Anti-Good Friday Agreement Republicans in that area. People who fitted the bill. The usual suspects, John Finucane called them. And a lot of things that were done. Who owned the fingerprint on the AK-47? Where was the AK-47 found? It certainly wasn't found near Brent McConville's house or near John Paul Wootton's house. You'd think that this would be the key evidence when it was found. We found the weapon that killed Stephen Carroll. We found a fingerprint on the magazine. Let's hunt this down. Let's find out who. Anybody that watches Columbo, Columbo would have been all over that one. Not in this case, no. We've got our two scapegoats. Let's start trying to piece together a case against them. And the case is very, very, very weak. Very weak. To the point you get what Angela says. Can you prove beyond reasonable doubt that John Paul Wootton ferried the murder weapon on the night of the killing? No, Your Honour. Can you prove beyond reasonable doubt that he ferried Brenton McConville on the night of the killing? No, Your Honour. Jerry Conlon gets up and says, that's it, folks. That has to be it. How can this stand following that? An admission that the core tenets of what they're telling you, they're convicted for. John Paul Wootton's convicted for carrying away the murder weapon and for carrying away Brenton McConville. And they've openly admitted at the appeal court, no, we can't prove that they did it. Well then, how do you prove it? Well, if you take everything in a worldview, if you take a worldview of everything we're told, whatever that means, if you take a worldview of this case, if you take a worldview of all this information, which if you take each piece, it can be contradicted. In reality, the forensics of this case are flawed and completely contradicted to the point that the appeal court didn't even deal with them. When Angela talks about a revolving door in and out, that's exactly what it was. What the appeal came down to, do you believe witness Z or do you believe witness M? And the appeal judges got up and says, we don't think witness Z is a credible witness. And somehow that means that witness M, the liar, proven that his eyesight was that short, that it was medically impossible for him to see as far as he said he seen on the night. So you have an eyewitness whose testimony is medically impossible. Yet, we don't believe witness Z. So witness M's, he's kosher. It's absolutely ridiculous. So you have to ask yourself is why they're doing it, why the men aren't back out on the street, why they're not letting go of this case. And it's very, very clear to me that there's something very, very rotten and sinister at the bottom of the killing of Stephen Carroll. And when you ask yourself, people whose names were mentioned in court, and then were later, well, you can't use his name again. He goes back to being person A. What that makes me think is that MI5 orchestrated the attack that led to the death of Stephen Carroll. And in the panic and the aftermath of it, where no casualties were expected and suddenly there's a casualty, Stephen Carroll was never meant to be at the scene. The TSG unit tasked from Armagh City to go and respond to the incident were heavily armed and in heavily armoured vehicles. Had the AK-47 used hit the heavily armed vehicles, the best it would have done was crack the window. But on their way out, Stephen Carroll was coming back in off beat. And they says to him, hey Stevie, do you know where this place is? Lismore Manor. We don't know where it's at. Sure, I'll take you out it. And he pulls in, and fate plays his hand, and he's shot dead. And in the aftermath of it, it's, we need somebody quick. We need to cover this up. And they're still covering it up. And it's up to us, the Craigavon 2 campaign, to rip that cover up to shreds. And the only way we can do that is by encouraging acts of solidarity. We're a very small committee. We're financially restrained. But what we are doing, there's lots of different community groups, there's lots of different political groups and prominent individuals, and we're saying take this case, take this information and run with it. Go out there and shout about it from the rooftops. In the case recently from Divis, they hung it off the bridge, and it annoyed the Belfast Telegraph that much. They talked about people supporting murderers on a campaign to glorify terrorism. We're not glorifying terrorism and we're not glorifying murders. What we're here to do is tell the truth and expose an injustice at the heart that goes to the very root of the system that they're trying to foist on us here in the north.
Thank you, Peggy. We're going to bring tonight's proceedings to a close. Before we do, we're going to have a question and answer session. So if anybody has any questions on some of the information that you've heard tonight or how you can help to progress the campaign for the two boys, just work away. I think one of the things that sort of jumps out tonight too is that in this town over the last few days, there have been an awful lot of angry politicians and an awful lot of angry media, and everybody's being whipped up on the frenzy over recent development. But what sort of gets to me is that it's selective anger. These people are entitled to be angry. But if you look at it deep down, they're not angry. You know, it's a game. They didn't get angry when somebody gets bit to death in this town with a hammer. They didn't get angry when young women get raped. They don't get angry with arson attacks, or they don't get angry when people are being evicted from their homes. But any excuse to get at Republicans, there's this rage. It's not really a rage, because if they wanted someone to be angry about, then they could have been in this room tonight, but they're not. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't even see any of the local media here. You know, they didn't even have the decency to turn up. So the chances is that a lot of stuff that was said here, if not all of it, will not be in the local papers tomorrow. You know, so I think it's a job of everybody here. They take this case and run. You know, because we need to have light at the end of the tunnel for the Bren and JP.
Well, I think I'll pass this one to Sarah to give the exact overview of the question. But I think there was about 12 or 13 questions each that were put forward, and I think that's a very high number for an appeal, where you get into the stage now where you're not going and saying, but that evidence is wrong. That judge can't have come to that decision. You can't say that. It's about points. It's about erring in points of law. It was like that with the appeal as well. It's where you're saying to the appeal court, Justice Girvan erred when he made that decision, because this is how the law's set out, and he didn't apply the law when he made that judgment. And now it's to a greater degree going to the Supreme Court, and there'll be a lot more scrutiny. So you're saying to the Supreme Court, these three appeal court judges, these Lord Chief Justice, have erred in their judgment, so it gets very, very narrow. And I think everybody was surprised that the appeal court certified one of the questions to go to the Supreme Court. Because basically what they're saying is, you got us there. We did that wrong, and now you can go to the Supreme Court and they'll decide whether that was right or wrong. What I will say is that the Supreme Court may, I don't think they're going to get up and say, yeah, the question's this, that, or the other. They're innocent. Open the door there and let them out. I don't think that's the case. But what can come out of it, if it's done right, is either another appeal or a retrial. And to be honest, having faced the appeal court judges and seen how good the appeal was, the appeal couldn't have been any better. Anyone who sat through the appeal, even the BBC reporters were saying to me they were walking. And there was shock. Even the journalists, there was a wee Presbyterian journalist sitting beside me, completely as far away as you could get from a Republican position. And she was saying they were walking. So, can you trust a body like that again? To go in there to hear all the same things over again? I don't think you can. I think what's needed is a retrial. Force witness M to come back out of his hiding hole and grill him. Force the court to drop the stupid anonymity order. Everybody knows who witness M is. Everybody knows who his father is. So who does it benefit that we don't know his identity? It means that the defence teams can't do their job properly, because they can't say, witness M's so-and-so. He's a vulnerable member of society. He has a drink problem. Sure, the guy in the off-licence here has an affidavit saying he's in every night buying a bottle of vodka. Those are the sort of things that you can't delve into, because they blank that. I think there was over 100 items of evidence where public interest immunity certificates were ordered, which meant you couldn't investigate them. You weren't allowed to talk about them. You couldn't say it. So that's over 100 items of evidence that couldn't be delved into. But I'll pass Sarah on here to give you an idea of the question that has been certified and is going to the Supreme Court.
The question that has been certified, you can only go to the Supreme Court on a point of law. So we've had provided the Court of Appeal with 9 different questions, and you can come up and look at them after. But the question that actually went through to the Supreme Court was, in a case where there's no specific role attached in an offence, how can you basically convict a person of an offence when there's no evidence? So in terms of timescale, we are unsure at this stage, but I would say roughly about a year probably, but that's just...
Suffering injustice and that miscarriage justice entail. I'd like to know what effect it's had on their family if they suffer every day with their loved ones incarcerated.
Catherine, this is John
It's been very, very hard. Our firstborn, our son, and he was only 17 as well. Taken into account the time of his arrest, he's doing 5 years so far out of an 18-year sentence for something he is completely innocent. John Paul, his sister, another brother, it's a broken relationship. He's stuck in McConville in a cell. His brother and sister isn't getting the time that they should be with him. And the same as Brenton, and well, their son is sitting 25 years. They're pensioners now. I mean, are they going to see their son free? It's really affected both families, and a very, very hard struggle when you're going up to visiting them, knowing that you're walking away and leaving them in them conditions. The rat, basically, for nothing. So just everybody's support has been brilliant, but we just want them home where they should be with their families. And thank you for all coming here and supporting the 2 families in the campaign.
Julian.
From an international supporting perspective, will there be an international day of action called for the Supreme Court day? And should we... International day of action for the day called for the Supreme Court?
Yes, that's something that the Craigavon 2 committee have discussed, and we have agreed that we should have an international day supporting the Craigavon 2. We haven't a date yet. It's something that we're trying to get a date that is relevant to the case, so that we can say today is the day that, and we are going to build world. We are already dealing with different countries in Europe, America, Canada, and Australia, where we have great support, as well as Scotland, England, and the whole of Ireland. So it is something that we're doing. We're not doing it this side of Christmas, but we feel that we have a window of an opportunity here of 3 to 6 months before it hits the Supreme Court, going by the solicitor's guidance. And we are going to try and raise this profile so high in every country in the world that Britain will know the eyes of the world are on them, and that there will be observers from all over the world taking note of how this case is concluded at the Supreme Court. So yes, is the answer. We are going to have a day of action, but at this stage we don't have a date. Thank you.
Is there any more questions? I'm just going to pass over to Angela now just to sum up tonight's proceedings.
It's really great to come into a room and see faces that we haven't seen before, because you're reaching out to strangers, you're reaching out to people that haven't been part of the campaign. They're not Belfast people, they're not Dublin people, they're Derry people, and they've taken the time to come out tonight to join us, to listen to the facts of the case. And I hope every single one of you leaves here with a sense of this is the biggest miscarriage of justice, and every one of you have a part to play to resolve it, to get these two men out of prison, because it can't be done by 10 men or women of the committee. It can't be done by the families. It has to have the support of every person that believes in justice and in human rights, because this is a human rights issue. Sharon Wootton's 17-year-old son, who was her eldest son and he was only 17, was taken away from her and has spent his 18th birthday, his 21st birthday in prison. And these are milestones in any young man's, life. They're milestones when you're 18, when you're 21. And, he's another 13 years today. So he's going to come out a grown man of 30. And as Catherine said there, with no relationship with his younger siblings, and he has to rebuild that all over again. And it is hard. I know grown men who have come out of prison after spending long and lengthy sentences, and it has taken them the rest of their lives to build on the relationships that they had with their children. Seeing your daddy once a week, or seeing your son once a week in a controlled area with hostile environment, with hostile people around you, is not conducive to developing relationships. Brendan McConville's mother and father, his mother's a lot younger than the dad, I have to say. No, but he was 73 last month, and his son has 25 years to do. And I hope he sees him free. I hope he lives to be 100. But there's every chance that he may not make it because of his age. And that's what they fear, that they will never see their son at home, sitting in the chair, having a cup of tea. And talk to these people. Go over and introduce yourself to them. Look into the eyes of the mother of John Paul Wootton. Look into the eyes of the parents of Brent McConville, and tell me you're not touched. Jerry Conlon said, when I spoke to Eileen McConville, I thought, that's how my mummy must have felt when she was writing letters and begging for support for her son, when she was writing to MPs, when she was writing to people involved in justice and getting knocked back, but she kept on and on and on. And Jerry Conlon, when he met Eileen McConville, said, I looked into her eyes and I just thought, you could have been my mummy. You're doing what my mummy did for me, and nobody listened. Nobody listened. The fight to get the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 out was an enormous battle, because Britain doesn't like to say they make a mistake. They don't like to tell you that there's malignant hands at work here in this country, and that they've always persecuted Irish men and women from their existence and taken over this country. It is their way. It is their way. So I want every single one of you to go out here tonight convinced that this is the biggest miscarriage of justice that you are witnessing, and that you're going to do something about it. Because no way is Britain going to get away with it. Not in my name. That's what every one of you say. Not in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks.